Jasmine Crockett, a passionate congresswoman, confronts Mike Johnson, a Republican leader, over a controversial police immunity bill that shields officers from accountability. As the debate intensifies, Jasmine exposes shocking evidence of police brutality. With public trust at an all-time low, Jasmine demands a full investigation into police misconduct, challenging Johnson's efforts to protect the system. Will she succeed in holding law enforcement accountable, or will the political machine stand in the way of justice? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the vaulted ceiling of the Capitol hearing chamber, a tense silence hung like fog before a thunderstorm. Ornate chandeliers cast cold light across the mahogany desks, but nothing warmed the atmosphere. At the center podium, Mike Johnson stood with a posture carved from stone, measured, composed, and fully aware of the cameras that framed him. The room was packed with aides, legal analysts, victims' families, and skeptical reporters who knew this wouldn't be a normal hearing. Johnson leaned toward the microphone, his tone steady but sharpened like a scalpel. "We are gathered today to defend those who defend us," he began. "Law enforcement officers risk their lives every day, only to return home and face lawsuits, harassment, and slander from activist mobs and liberal judges." He paused, letting the words pierce the air. This legislation, the Federal Police Immunity Enhancement Act, isn't a loophole. It's a shield, a necessary one. His final sentence struck with calculated force. "We need to protect the protectors." A ripple moved through the room. Not applause, not dissent, just a low hum of tension shifting from seat to seat. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters scribbled. Jasmine Crockett sat still in her seat, a black blazer hugging her frame like battle armor. Her hands were folded, her posture unflinching, but it was her eyes that drew attention. Eyes that didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't soften. They locked onto Johnson with a glare cold enough to silence applause and hot enough to scorch through granite. She said nothing. Not yet. But her presence was a countdown, a pressure building beneath the surface. The staffer beside her dared not interrupt. The room could feel it. Something dangerous, something honest was sitting in that chair. Her silence screamed louder than any outburst. Mike Johnson, confident and unaware, returned to his notes, but Jasmine Crockett was already preparing her first word like it was a weapon forged in fire. And when it came, it would cut through the room like judgment. The silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's piercing stare was not a pause. It was a wound. It split the chamber open just enough for everyone to feel the weight of what had not yet been said. Reporters shifted in their seats, pens frozen midair. Some aides leaned forward unconsciously, drawn to the friction building like static between two thunderclouds. Mike Johnson, sensing it but misunderstanding its nature, leaned further into his role. Not as a mediator, not even as a lawmaker, but as a man defending a fortress he believed was under siege. His voice steadied, but his cadence hardened. Words sharpened, not for truth, but for control. He didn't glance at Crockett yet, not quite. Instead, he pivoted toward the microphone, holding a stack of printed reports in one hand, like a verdict sealed in ink. "Let's stop pretending this isn't a crisis," he said, his tone deepening, measured to sound reasonable even as it twisted reality. Last year, over 5,000 trained officers with families, records of service, and decades of dedication, left the force across this country, not because of pay, not because of danger, but because of fear. He paused, letting the words sink like a stone into a pool of outrage. Fear of being sued for doing their jobs. Fear of having a cell phone video taken out of context destroy 20 years of service. Fear of walking into a courtroom as a defendant instead of a defender. He raised a document, an internal memorandum from the National Police Federation, and held it just high enough for cameras to capture it. This report shows a staggering 43% increase in civil litigation targeting law enforcement personnel. Many of these lawsuits, ladies and gentlemen, are baseless. They are not about justice. They are about punishment. Vengeance dressed up as virtue. He slapped the document onto the table. The echo bounced across the chamber like a gavel of his own. How do we expect men and women to serve, to walk into chaos, to face down danger, when they know every decision, every second, could end not just their career, but their livelihood, their home, their future. His tone grew darker, more deliberate, pushing toward righteous indignation. We are bleeding out our best and brightest because we've allowed the courtroom to become a weapon against those we send to keep order. Still no glance toward Jasmine, but the setup was complete. His voice softened just slightly, his volume lowered, and now finally he turned. Slowly, deliberately, like a blade being drawn. He looked directly at her. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, voice soaked in rehearsed politeness that barely concealed its edge. "I appreciate your passion, but passion without discipline is just noise, and this chamber deserves more than noise." The words didn't echo. They struck. Clean, cold, precise. Behind him, a few aides exchanged smirks, emboldened by the moment. The crowd didn't erupt, but something shifted. Something smug. Something sharp. Jasmine didn't twitch. Her fingers rested gently on the lacquered surface of the desk, motionless but alive with tension. The lights caught the edge of her cheekbone, the fire behind her stillness unmistakable to anyone truly watching. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was a promise. Mike Johnson didn't know it yet, but with those 13 words, he hadn't dismissed her. He had summoned her. He had summoned her, and the room felt it, not like a ripple, but like the stillness before a fault line gives way. Jasmine Crockett rose slowly, deliberately, with the kind of composure that doesn't ask for silence. It commands it. No papers in her hands, no speech prepared, no tablet glowing with pre-written lines. All she brought to the podium was lived experience, unprocessed grief, and a moral clarity so sharp it cut the distance between her and every man in that room. Her chair slid back without a sound, but the air shifted around her like gravity itself had changed direction. The lens of every camera in the chamber snapped toward her in unison. Not because she moved, but because she meant to move. Her frame, though modest in height, seemed to stretch taller under the weight of everything she was carrying, and yet there was no rage in her posture, only precision, no panic, only purpose. She stood like a prosecutor in the highest court of the land, except this court had forgotten the names of the dead. She had not. Her voice came next, low, restrained, yet heavy as judgment, and it split the room in half. "You speak about officers resigning," she said, and even her pause afterward felt intentional, weaponized. "I want to know, who speaks for the people who were shot dead and never got a day in court, never got an investigation, never even got a name read into this record?" Her words were not a question. They were a verdict, and it landed with a cold finality that made several lawmakers blink without realizing it. One aide, seated behind the subcommittee desk, instinctively reached for a pen, only to set it back down, paralyzed by the shift in tone. Jasmine's eyes remained locked forward, not flaring, not wild, but utterly still, as if motion itself might corrupt the truth she had just delivered. In that moment, she was not debating. She was accusing, not on behalf of a party, but on behalf of the unburied. Mike Johnson didn't speak. No one did. Even the microphones seemed to hesitate, holding her words inside their metal frames like confessionals sealed shut. The chamber was no longer a chamber. It had become a mirror, one that forced every man and woman inside to confront what they'd chosen to ignore. That behind every statistic Johnson had thrown on paper, there was blood still drying, lives still uncounted, and ghosts still waiting for their names to be said aloud. And Jasmine Crockett had just opened the door wide enough for all of them to enter. The air in the room thickened, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Jasmine Crockett stood there, her presence filling the space like a force that couldn't be denied, couldn't be ignored. Every eye in the chamber was on her, but it wasn't the way they looked at her that mattered. It was the way they felt her presence. The weight of every injustice she was about to bring to light pressed down on them like an unrelenting tide. And she hadn't even begun speaking yet. Without a hint of hesitation, her voice broke the stillness, calm, controlled, yet laced with the power of 1,000 unspoken truths. "Breonna Taylor." The name hung in the air, as if the room itself was caught in its gravity. The sharpness of her voice sliced through the tension. Tamir Rice. There was no mercy in her delivery, no softness. Every syllable landed with purpose. George Floyd. With each name, the collective breath of the room faltered. Every person present, regardless of their position or political alliance, felt it. The weight of those words, each one a life stolen, a life erased by the very systems meant to protect them. Jasmine let the names linger in the air like a death sentence they couldn't escape. Eric Garner, she finished, her voice steady but unyielding, as if she was summoning the spirits of the fallen into the room, demanding they be heard. The room was silent, but it wasn't the peaceful silence of agreement. It was the silence of accountability. The silence that came when the unspoken truth had been said aloud, and there was nowhere to hide from it. She paused, letting the power of those names build, to make sure no one in that room could forget what they meant. She could feel the eyes on her, some uncomfortable, some defiant, but all forced to reckon with what she was about to say next. Jasmine's hand moved to the side and grabbed a thick binder. It was no more than a stack of papers, but to her it was the weight of 1,000 lives, the untold stories of victims forgotten. She slammed the binder onto the table, the noise echoing across the chamber, causing a few heads to jerk back in surprise. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was final. This, she said, her voice firm and unwavering, this is a list of 217 civilians who were killed by law enforcement officers, their lives taken with impunity, with no consequences. Her hand hovered over the binder, but it wasn't just a document she was presenting. It was a living accusation, a testament to every death swept under the rug, every name erased by the machinery of power. 217, she repeated, letting the number roll off her tongue, as if saying it again would make them feel the gravity of it. 217 people who died, shot, beaten, choked, and not one officer was held accountable. The chamber fell deeper into silence. The weight of her words settled over them, suffocating, undeniable. Jasmine's gaze swept over the room, and for the first time, she let herself look at the faces of those who had always turned a blind eye. These aren't just statistics, she continued, her voice rising with the force of her passion, but still controlled, deliberate. These are lives. These were sons, daughters, mothers, fathers. These people were not just numbers on a sheet of paper. They were human beings, and their lives were worth no less than anyone else's. Yet they were silenced, erased, ignored by a system meant to protect them. Her eyes never left the faces of those who opposed her. She could feel their discomfort. She could feel them shifting under the weight of what she was saying. The room, the nation, could no longer hide behind half-truths and political rhetoric. Jasmine wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every mother who had lost a child to unjust violence, every victim who had never seen justice, every family left in the cold without answers. And with every name, with every page she turned in that binder, she made sure the room understood. You cannot look away anymore. As the last of her words hung in the air, a soft sob was heard behind her. A mother had begun to cry, her hands clutching a photograph of her lost son, the weight of that grief pressing down on her chest. Jasmine didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had already said everything that needed to be said. The sorrow in that room had already taken root. The room still hummed with the remnants of Jasmine's words, the names she had spoken hanging in the air like ghosts, unseen but unshakable. The heaviness of 217 lives, each taken with impunity, clung to the room like a thick fog. But Mike Johnson, despite the sudden weight of it all, remained unshaken. He straightened his suit, adjusting his tie with a practiced motion. His eyes didn't flicker. His voice was as cold and composed as ever, cutting through the tension like a razor. We cannot tear down an entire system based on the mistakes of a few individuals, he said, his words deliberate, each one calculated. His voice was firm, but there was an edge to it, a subtle arrogance creeping into his tone. Yes, there have been tragic incidents. Yes, some officers have gone too far. But we must not let these isolated cases define the entire law enforcement community. This system was built to protect. He paused for a moment, as though weighing the words carefully before delivering them with the full force of his rhetoric. We cannot let the media and political pressure force us to dismantle the very institutions that keep our communities safe. His gaze drifted over the room, searching for those who would rally behind his words. We cannot allow the actions of a few bad apples to define the entire tree. Jasmine sat there, her posture unflinching, every fiber of her being radiating an intensity that matched the atmosphere. She felt the words slicing through the air, but it wasn't the first time she'd heard them. She knew this argument too well, the defense of power, the justification of systemic failure, the plea to protect the status quo at all costs. But this time, there was something different in the air. There was a deep, undeniable ache that could no longer be ignored, no matter how hard they tried to mask it. Mike Johnson continued, his voice now rising with the cadence of someone certain that his argument would win the room over. What we are talking about here isn't just a few bad decisions. It's about protecting those who risk their lives every single day. Law enforcement officers should not be treated as criminals simply because of the stories that sell in the media. We need to stop turning every police officer into a villain just because it's convenient for the narrative. He looked directly at Jasmine now, his eyes sharp, his smirk barely noticeable. The words were meant to sting, to undermine her credibility. He leaned forward slightly, just enough to signal a challenge, his next words dripping with condescension. "You've spent more time on social media than in actual lawmaking," he said, his voice smooth, mocking even. "Maybe that's why you confuse headlines with hard evidence." The room went still. His words hit with the sharpness of a slap, and for a moment it felt as if the entire chamber held its breath. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't react outwardly. But inside, the words landed like a punch to the gut. He was playing the oldest game in the book, the one that dismissed her as a politician of the moment, a headline chaser with no substance. It was a line he had used countless times before, designed to disarm, to belittle. But it wouldn't work this time. Jasmine Crockett wasn't a rookie in these battles. She had learned long ago how to stand firm in the face of people like him. Her gaze never wavered from him. She didn't need to respond in the same tone, didn't need to match his arrogance with her own. The truth was her weapon, and she had just set it in motion. The weight of his words, their dismissal of everything she had fought for, was clear. But Jasmine had a strength that came from years of watching the system fail, years of witnessing the consequences of that failure, and years of fighting to make those in power see the damage they had caused. And she knew this moment was one of many that would define how far she was willing to go. As the last of Johnson's words hung in the air, Jasmine's hands subtly tightened on the edge of the table, her fingers pressing into the wood as if drawing strength from the very surface. She had been dismissed, undermined, but she wasn't done. Not yet, not by a long shot. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every eye was on Jasmine as she stood motionless for a moment, allowing the silence to expand, to make her presence felt in a way words could not. Mike Johnson had spoken with the authority of someone who thought he had all the answers. But Jasmine knew something he didn't, that the truth had a way of rising, no matter how deep they tried to bury it. She reached into her bag without a flicker of hesitation, as if she had already anticipated this moment long before the hearing began. Her fingers brushed the small USB drive, a nondescript piece of plastic that contained the weight of justice denied. Her gaze remained locked on Johnson, but it wasn't just him she was addressing now. It was everyone who had ever turned a blind eye to the truth, every person who had swept the pain of the voiceless under the rug of political convenience. She held the USB up, the small device reflecting the harsh light of the room. "This," she began, her voice steady but piercing, "is the truth you've been avoiding." The words echoed through the room, sharp and clear. She could feel the shift in the air as she pressed the button to play the recording. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like the prelude to an inevitable reckoning. The audio filled the room, muffled at first but clear enough to cut through the tension like a knife. The voice on the recording was unmistakable. A police officer, his tone dripping with a disturbing sense of entitlement. "Don't worry," the officer's voice sneered, low and casual. "I've got the law protecting me." There was a sound of a struggle, a grunt, and then a sickening crack, followed by a brief, unsettling silence. "That immigrant's arm is broken. But I'm covered. I'm untouchable. The words hung in the air, sickeningly final. Jasmine's eyes never left Johnson as the room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, and the unmistakable sound of disbelief filled the space. The recording had cracked open a dark secret that the system had tried desperately to keep hidden. The officer's words were not just those of a rogue individual, they were the embodiment of the rot that ran through the very core of the system Johnson had been defending. Jasmine had given them a window into the impunity, the arrogance, the corruption that was too often allowed to go unchecked. Mike Johnson's face turned a shade of pale Jasmine had never seen before. His jaw clenched, and for a split second, she saw him try to hold his composure. But the facade was gone. His fingers gripped the edge of the podium, knuckles turning white. His lips parted as if searching for a defense. But the words didn't come. How could they? The truth was too raw, too real for him to dismiss with a casual flick of the wrist. The weight of what had just been revealed was suffocating, and for the first time in the hearing, the room wasn't looking at him. They were looking at the undeniable evidence of a broken system. The noise that followed was deafening. The gallery erupted in outrage, voices rising in disbelief, some shouting, others sitting in stunned silence. But Jasmine didn't react to it. She didn't look at the crowd or the reporters' frantic scribbling. She kept her eyes locked on Johnson, waiting for him to find the words to defend the indefensible. She was patient, resolute. This was her moment. She had shown them the truth, and now there was no escaping it. The moment stretched on, and Jasmine remained steady. She had been in this fight long enough to know that the truth wasn't just something you fought for. It was something you had to make others face, whether they were ready or not. And Mike Johnson, for all his calculated rhetoric, wasn't ready for this. He had underestimated the power of what Jasmine had brought into that room. The recording had stripped away the layers of his defense, the polished arguments he had spent so long crafting, and now he was left exposed, nothing more than a man trying to justify the unjustifiable. Jasmine didn't need to say another word. The truth had already done its work. The room was a maelstrom of sound and fury, the echoes of the audio still rippling through the space. But as quickly as the noise had erupted, Mike Johnson sought to regain control. His face, initially pale from the shock of Jasmine's revelation, had now regained its practiced, steely composure. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened, and for a moment, his hands gripped the podium so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He was trying to suppress something that threatened to rise from beneath the layers of his political armor. But he knew better than to show weakness. He couldn't afford to lose this battle. Not in front of the cameras, not in front of his colleagues. His voice, when it came, was colder, harder, tuned to strike back. We cannot rely on unverified videos or audios to indict an entire institution, Johnson declared, his tone sharp and dismissive, as though the evidence Jasmine had presented was nothing more than an inconvenience. This is not about justice. This is about political theater. He straightened up, his posture signaling authority as if to remind the room who held the power here. His gaze flicked toward Jasmine, a flash of contempt crossing his features. What you've presented here is nothing more than a political stunt, turning law enforcement into the villain to score points for your agenda. The words hung in the air like smoke, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Her expression was a mask of stillness, her body unmoving except for the faintest tightening of her fingers around the edge of the table. Johnson believed he could dismiss her, brush her off with another round of rhetoric. But Jasmine knew something he didn't. He had already lost. The tension built as he leaned further into the microphone, as if pushing the weight of his words deeper into the room. "This isn't a courtroom drama, Miss Crockett," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, calculated to belittle her and minimize the magnitude of what she had exposed. "You're not auditioning for a Netflix series, so spare us the theatrics." He smiled, but it was a smile that lacked any true humor. It was the kind of smile that said he believed himself to be above it all, above the accusations, above the truth Jasmine had just laid bare. Behind him, a few colleagues shifted in their seats, perhaps smirking along with him. But the room had already begun to tilt away from him, and Jasmine could feel it, the shift in the atmosphere, the subtle but irreversible change in the dynamic. Jasmine's eyes never wavered from his. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken a word, but the silence she allowed to stretch between them was far louder than any verbal exchange. She could hear the indignant murmurs from the back of the room, the disbelief from the gallery, but none of it touched her. It was a deliberate, calculated calm. She wasn't just waiting for her turn to speak. She was waiting for him to reveal himself. And then, without warning, Johnson pushed further, his words now coming faster, harder, as if trying to assert some kind of dominance over the room. "If defending criminals is your idea of justice," he continued, his voice rising with self-righteous indignation, "maybe you're in the wrong chamber or the wrong country." The challenge in his words was clear. It wasn't just an attack on her character. It was an attempt to shame her for standing up for what was right, for daring to oppose the prevailing narrative. His words were calculated, meant to cut, to discredit her in front of the very people she was trying to reach. The room held its breath, but Jasmine's reaction was nothing like the shock he might have anticipated. She didn't flinch. She didn't lash out. Instead, she gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile, one that was more dangerous than any insult. Her eyes, cold and unyielding, remained fixed on him, unwavering. The stillness of her gaze, the quiet power she emanated, made his words feel like they had no place to land. She didn't need to raise her voice or escalate the tension. She was already in control of the room. Then slowly, deliberately, she spoke. "Do you want me to bring the victim in here, Mr. Johnson?" The question hung in the air with the weight of an executioner's sentence. It wasn't a challenge. It was an offer. The room went silent again. Jasmine's words were a calm invitation, a challenge to the man who had just accused her of playing a game. The way she said it, so simply, so directly, rendered Johnson's accusations meaningless. She had just turned the tables. She was no longer the politician defending an idea. She was a voice for the silenced, a witness to the truth he had tried to bury. The silence that followed her words was almost unbearable. Johnson opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time, he was unsure. He had tried to discredit her, to undermine her with insults and political bravado, but now the reality of what she had presented loomed over him. Jasmine had just made him look like a man desperately clinging to a lie, a man trying to protect a system that had failed too many people for far too long. And in that silence, Jasmine stood, unshaken, while the weight of everything she had exposed hung in the air like a final judgment. The room was suspended in a charged silence, heavy with the gravity of what Jasmine had just revealed. The room's tension felt palpable, thick enough to suffocate. Jasmine knew that exposing the system for what it was had only just begun. The weight of 217 lives hung in the air, demanding something more than words, more than rhetoric. Now it was time to show them the faces behind the names, the pain behind the statistics. She motioned for someone in the back to step forward. A woman, her face drawn with grief, yet there was an undeniable strength in her bearing. Her dark skin was like the earth beneath her, weathered but enduring. She walked slowly, each step heavy with purpose. There was no hesitation, no fear in her stride, but the silence that followed her was deafening. She had lived through something that should have been impossible, an injustice that had swallowed her entire world. Jasmine's voice was calm, almost reverent as she addressed the room. "Please tell us your story," she said, knowing that the woman had waited too long to have her truth heard. The woman standing before the committee now, her hands trembling just slightly, took a moment to steady herself before speaking. The grief was there, in the sharp tremor of her voice, but underneath it was something far more powerful, a raw, unstoppable courage. "My son," she began, her voice shaking but clear. "He was 17. A boy just starting his life. He had dreams. He didn't carry a weapon. He wasn't a threat to anyone. He was just waiting in a parking lot. That was his crime." She paused, blinking hard to hold back the tears. The room was still, hanging on every word she spoke. "They pulled him out of his car, just like that. No reason, no explanation. They threw him to the ground. My son was begging them, trying to explain, trying to tell them he was just waiting for a friend. But they didn't care." Her voice cracked, and she took a sharp breath, trying to compose herself. They beat him. They hit him again and again until he couldn't breathe. He cried out. He begged. He was 17, and the words faltered in her throat. She couldn't say it. She didn't need to. The pain was too much, and the room felt it too. A tear slipped down her cheek, but her voice held firm, powered by a truth she couldn't deny anymore. And when he was gone, when my son was lying there, on that cold concrete, those officers just walked away. They didn't stop. They didn't even look back. My son died, and they walked away. Her hands clenched into fists, but her voice remained steady, cutting through the air like a blade. No charges, no investigation. They let him die, and they didn't even have the decency to pretend they cared. The room was unnervingly still, as though time had stopped moving. Jasmine watched, her gaze unwavering, her heart heavy with the weight of this mother's grief. The woman's voice trembled, but she didn't falter. I just want to know, who will answer for his life? Who will answer for the last words he said? Who will answer for the life they stole from me? Her voice broke completely, and the room felt the power in the question. Raw, aching, unrelenting. Tears flowed freely now, her face contorting in pain that had been buried for too long. The quiet sobs of the woman filled the room, a painful reminder of the cost of the laws they protected. Jasmine didn't speak immediately. She allowed the silence to stretch, to settle in, to make every single person in that room feel the immense weight of the words they had just heard. Then Jasmine spoke, not with anger, but with the quiet intensity of someone who had been fighting for far too long, someone who had lived with this pain. This, she said, her voice unwavering, is what we are talking about. This is what Mike Johnson is defending. The system that leaves mothers like this with no answers, no justice, no peace. This is the reality of the law they want to protect. She let the words linger in the air, heavy and undeniable. This mother, this woman who has lost her son, who will never get to hear his laugh again, to watch him grow into a man, she deserves justice. But instead, she gets a system that allows those who killed him to go free. Jasmine's eyes swept across the room, challenging anyone to deny the truth of what she was saying. What do you say to this woman? What do you say to her pain? Do you tell her that the system is fine? That it works? Jasmine's voice had risen, but there was no anger in it, only the raw, palpable grief of someone who had seen too much. The room was silent now, suffocating under the weight of her words, and for the first time in that hearing, it felt as if the world had stopped, the only thing left being the truth of a mother's loss, the truth of a system that had failed her, and the truth that Jasmine was demanding be heard. The room seemed to contract under the weight of the woman's testimony, each word she spoke pressing down harder, as though the very air was being squeezed out of the space. The mother's grief, raw and relentless, had pierced through the polished veneer of Mike Johnson's calm. But it hadn't broken him, at least not yet. His face remained composed, though the faintest tremor in his hands betrayed a crack in his armor. He had heard it before, the sob stories, the emotional pleas, the calls for justice. But he wasn't moved by emotion. He was a politician, trained to weather storms like this. He knew how to hold a position, how to bury inconvenient truths beneath the weight of his rhetoric. With a sharp inhale, Johnson adjusted his position, his hands resting flat on the podium. The sound of his voice sliced through the thick silence like a surgeon's scalpel, precise and clinical. Thank you for sharing your personal story, he said, his tone smooth, almost too practiced. But let me remind you, emotion cannot replace policy. His words were spoken with such practiced authority, as though his simple acknowledgement of the woman's pain were enough to absolve him of any deeper responsibility. We cannot allow individual tragedies, no matter how heartbreaking, to dictate the policies that affect an entire nation. He straightened his back, the posture of a man prepared to dismiss what could not be easily explained away. The room seemed to hold its breath, the camera flashes almost coming to a standstill as the collective focus shifted back to Johnson. He leaned slightly forward, his voice gaining an edge as he shifted from politician to advocate of the system he was defending. This bill, he said, his voice rising with a hint of finality, is not just legislation. It is a symbol of the restoration of trust. It's about reinstating faith in the law enforcement community. We cannot allow the actions of a few to undermine the integrity of the many. The law is about stability, about justice, and this bill is the first step toward fixing what's broken. He paused, the self-assurance in his words enough to fill the room with an almost suffocating certainty. Jasmine Crockett stood motionless, her eyes never leaving his, the tension in the room palpable. She had heard this all before. She had listened to the same line of defense in courtroom after courtroom, from the same kind of men, with the same smug certainty in their voices. She knew what came next. The deflection, the justification, the attempts to sanitize the brutal truths that people like her had witnessed, time and time again. She wasn't surprised by his rhetoric, but she was going to make sure it didn't go unchallenged. Jasmine's gaze was unwavering, and she gave the slightest nod, acknowledging his words, but there was no agreement in it. Her lips pressed together in a thin line, her jaw clenched in quiet resolve. The room seemed to shrink around them, the weight of the next words that would leave her lips building steadily, like the calm before a storm. She hadn't said anything yet, but everything about her presence spoke volumes. She was preparing for the final blow. The air in the room was thick, suffocating under the weight of Jasmine's actions. She had already stripped the facade of justice away with her words, but now as she reached into her bag, the tension was palpable, the audience already sensing that something far worse was coming. Jasmine's fingers closed around the cold edge of the laptop, pulling it out slowly, deliberately, like a weapon she had been preparing for this moment her entire career. She didn't need to speak. The laptop itself held the key to everything. The moment the device was powered on, the room fell silent. Not a sound, not a whisper. Jasmine positioned the laptop in front of her and turned it so that the committee and the cameras could see the screen. She glanced at Mike Johnson one last time, her eyes piercing, but her demeanor remained calm. The quiet before the storm was almost unbearable. The video began to load, its frame flickering to life. The image was grainy at first, but as the screen brightened, the scene revealed itself in disturbing detail. A corner store parking lot. A young man, no older than 18, standing alone outside the shop. He looked unassuming. No threat, no malice in his body language. Then the flashing lights, the uniformed officers, they arrived without warning, the blue and black colors of authority cutting through the quiet night. The young man froze, confusion clear on his face as he realized the officers were coming toward him. His hands were visible. He was unarmed. His eyes darted nervously from one officer to another, trying to process what was happening. But before he could even raise a question, the officers descended on him with brutal force. The camera shook as the confrontation escalated, fast, unrelenting. The officers didn't give him a chance to speak. No commands, no questions, just immediate force. They slammed him to the ground with sickening precision. The young man's body was twisted, crushed under the weight of 2 or 3 officers, their boots stomping into him. He cried out, he begged. His hands were pinned to the asphalt. There was no reason to strike him, no weapon, no violence from him. Yet they didn't stop. The sound of his body being beaten, the sickening crack of his bones, the harshness of every punch and knee landing on his vulnerable body echoed through the footage. The camera caught it all, his desperation, his pain, the futility of it all, the struggle for breath, the way his body went limp. The officers didn't stop even when he couldn't move anymore. One of them stood up, towering over the young man's now motionless body, his face cold and detached, like he was surveying a piece of property. His voice came through loud and clear, cutting through the noise like a sharp blade. "Don't worry," the officer sneered almost casually. "I'm covered." The words were chilling. "I've got the law protecting me." The officer was untouchable, or so he believed. He spoke with an arrogance that suggested he was untouchable not only by law, but by the very rules of humanity. "I'm untouchable," he repeated, as if daring anyone to challenge him. And just like that, the boy, already struggling to breathe, already near death, was left abandoned on the concrete. The video paused momentarily as the horrific finality of the scene settled in. The boy's body lay there, lifeless. And yet the officers seemed indifferent, as if what had just happened was routine. What followed was the unmistakable sound of one officer muttering, "I don't fear anything." A final, damning statement that sealed the truth of what had just transpired. Jasmine didn't need to speak. The video was damning enough. But she did, her voice cutting through the shocked silence like a whip. "This is what we are defending? This is what you are trying to protect with your bill, Mr. Johnson." Her eyes never left the screen, never wavered from the audience in front of her. This officer had no fear. He knew he was covered. He knew he could do this and walk away without consequence. "And this," Jasmine continued, her voice growing colder, "is what your bill defends. It is a system that allows this to happen, and when it does, it walks away." The room was frozen. The video was still playing, but no one was watching it anymore. Not just the officers, not just the political figures, but everyone in the room, the nation, who now saw what this system was capable of. Jasmine's gaze was steady, unyielding. There were no more words to hide behind, no more arguments to be made. Mike Johnson stood motionless, his face drained of color, his earlier confidence evaporating like smoke in the harsh light of truth. And Jasmine, poised and unmoved, allowed that truth to hang in the room for just a moment longer. The weight of it was unbearable, and it was clear. There was no escaping what had just been shown. The weight of the video still hung in the room, a heavy presence that no one could escape. The air was thick, suffocating under the knowledge of what had just been exposed. For a moment it felt as if time had stopped. Every eye in the room was fixed on the screen, yet no one was truly looking at it anymore. They were staring at the silence, at the uncomfortable truth, and it was as if the very walls of the chamber had begun to close in on them. Then with a sudden, almost violent motion, a Republican committee member slammed his pen onto the desk. The sound of it was like a gunshot in the room, loud enough to draw everyone's attention. His face was flushed, his body stiff with indignation. He rose from his chair without a word, his eyes not meeting anyone's, and walked out of the room with an almost military precision. His footsteps echoed as they faded into the hallway, the door swinging shut behind him with a resounding thud. The room was left in a stunned silence, as if everyone had just witnessed a public surrender, a withdrawal that spoke volumes more than any words could. A soft sound broke the quiet, a sob. It came from one of the reporters in the back of the room, her hand pressed tightly against her mouth, trying to stifle the emotion that had suddenly overwhelmed her. She hadn't expected to be moved like this. She was here for the story, but what she had just seen was no longer just a story. It was a wound, raw, bleeding, and impossible to ignore. Her eyes were red as she blinked back the tears, but she couldn't stop them from falling. She was not alone in her reaction, but hers was the only sob to be heard. The rest of the room was still. Even Mike Johnson, standing behind his podium, appeared momentarily lost, his face a mixture of disbelief and frustration. He had tried to spin the narrative, tried to tell them that this was just a political game, but now, standing there in the wake of the video, he had nothing left to say. The silence hung between them like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating, until Jasmine's voice cut through it with the precision of a blade. She hadn't moved from her spot. Her presence was still and unyielding, a force in and of itself. Her gaze, however, was no longer on the screen. It was fixed directly on Mike Johnson, unwavering, piercing. Her eyes, cold and determined, seemed to burn through him. The room was on the edge of its seat, waiting for her to speak, waiting for the words that would come next. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice steady, but the power in it was undeniable. "What are you protecting?" The question hung in the air, a simple one, but one that was meant to unearth the truth, to drag it kicking and screaming into the light. She leaned in slightly, not just to address him, but to make sure everyone in the room could hear it, feel it. "Are you protecting order?" Her voice grew slightly but still controlled, each word meticulously crafted to land with devastating effect. "Or are you protecting the right to kill, with no accountability, no justice?" The room seemed to collectively inhale. Johnson's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edges of the podium, as though the very action would keep him grounded. He knew what she was doing. He knew the stakes. But he wasn't prepared for the directness of her assault. He wasn't prepared for her to strip away the veneer of politics and confront him with something far simpler, more primal. The choice between protecting a broken system or protecting the lives of the people it was supposed to serve. Jasmine's eyes never left him. There was no hesitation, no wavering in her gaze. It was as if she had already seen his answer, already known how he would react, and was prepared for it. But she wasn't letting him off the hook. Not this time. "What are you protecting, Mr. Johnson?" Her voice was now more forceful, and the question became a challenge. "Are you defending law enforcement, or are you defending lawlessness?" The words weren't just accusations, they were a mirror. They reflected everything Johnson had tried to protect: his career, his legacy, his vision of law and order, and shattered it in an instant. He could no longer stand behind the shield of political rhetoric. He could no longer hide behind the tired tropes of protecting the police. The evidence was right there in front of him. He had failed to acknowledge the victims, the pain, the real lives lost in the wake of the law he claimed to defend. For a moment, Johnson stood there, speechless. His lips moved, but no words came out. The room, which had once been dominated by his voice, was now taken over by Jasmine's unflinching stare. She had stripped him of his defenses, exposed the heart of his argument for what it was: a shield for a system that allowed tragedy after tragedy to unfold without consequence. His face reddened, his expression hardening. But Jasmine didn't back down. She didn't flinch. She wasn't going to let him bury this with more empty rhetoric. Behind her, the gallery remained still. The reporters were scribbling furiously, capturing every moment, every word. But the eyes in the room were on Jasmine, watching her as she pressed forward with a quiet intensity that could no longer be ignored. "You have spent your time," she said, her voice low but unwavering, "fighting to protect a system that protects nothing but itself. And you stand here, in the face of everything we've seen, and you dare to lecture us about law and order?" Her voice broke through his defenses like a tidal wave. "You cannot look at what just happened and say that this bill is about justice." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "This bill is not about justice, Mr. Johnson. It is about keeping people in power, no matter the cost." The tension in the room was now at a boiling point. Jasmine had turned the table. Mike Johnson's carefully constructed arguments now lay in ruins, shattered by her unflinching truth. Her eyes, still locked on his, were unyielding, cold as steel. She had just given him his moment to defend himself, but there was nothing left to say. As the room shifted, people leaned in closer, hanging on her every word, waiting for the final strike. Jasmine stood like a force of nature, the weight of her words still ringing in the air. Mike Johnson had lost his footing, but Jasmine had only just begun to expose the truth. The battle wasn't over. It had only just started. The silence in the room was deafening, oppressive even, as the video continued to play. The footage had struck with the force of a hurricane, devastating everything in its path. The chaotic sounds from the recording were still lingering in the air, like the screams of a victim too often ignored. And now, as the final scene unfolded, the weight of the truth was undeniable. Mike Johnson, once so assured of his position, stood frozen, his face pale and twisted in a way that betrayed the cracks in his carefully constructed armor. The reality had settled into the room, and it was undeniable. The system was broken, and the people who had long been its defenders were now exposed for what they truly were. For a moment, the room felt stuck in time. No one dared speak. No one dared move. The tension was thick, wrapping around everyone like a vice, squeezing every last bit of air out of the space. Jasmine Crockett stood still, her presence powerful, unwavering, as if the weight of her words had already done its work. The shock had passed. Now it was time for the reckoning. Then it happened. One of the Republican congressmen, his face a mixture of anger and confusion, shifted in his seat. His hand moved to the microphone, and his voice, strained, unsure, cut through the silence. "Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I think we need to take a moment. We need to pause. We need to discuss what we've just seen before proceeding further." The words were tentative, hesitant, as if he too was grappling with the gravity of what had been revealed. His eyes flicked nervously around the room, not quite meeting anyone's gaze. The room was charged with energy now, the tension spreading like wildfire. More members of the committee from both sides of the aisle began to murmur their agreement. Some looked at one another uncertain, unsure of what to do next. The video had shattered the narrative, pulling back the curtain on the darkness they had long ignored. For the first time, the truth was undeniable, and no amount of political spin could hide it. The murmurs grew louder as another voice, this time a more senior Republican, spoke up. "I agree with my colleague," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, yet full of a quiet conviction. "We need to reconsider this bill. We can't move forward with a vote when something this serious has come to light." His words were like the sound of a key turning in a lock, the beginning of a shift, a crack in the foundation of Johnson's unwavering defense. The air in the room thickened further, the realization settling in that they were no longer playing a political game. This was real. This was life and death. And the system they were trying to protect had just been exposed for its complicity in the violence. Johnson's jaw clenched as he stood, trying to maintain his composure. He had spent years crafting this bill, pushing it forward with the belief that it would restore order, protect the law enforcement community. But now the very people who had once rallied behind him were beginning to falter. One by one, his allies, those who had stood firm in their support, began to hesitate. Some looked away, others exchanged furtive glances, but none were willing to meet his eyes. His voice, when it came, was strained and brittle. "We cannot let emotion drive this process," Johnson insisted, his words laced with desperation. "This is about the rule of law. This is about restoring confidence in the institutions that protect us." But there was no confidence in his words. They fell flat, hollow against the truth that had already been exposed. Jasmine's eyes remained locked on him, unwavering, unyielding. She had already won. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned, and now she was ready to push further. "Mr. Chairman," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the murmurs and uncertainty in the room, "I'm not here for policy that ignores the truth. I'm not here to let this moment slip by as just another tragedy to be glossed over. We need action. We need accountability." She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle in, her gaze sweeping the room, seeing the faces of those who had once stood firm in defense of a broken system. "It's time we finally face the reality of what's happening in our communities. The police cannot be above the law, and we cannot continue to protect them when they commit violence with impunity." Her words were sharp, and they hit their target with surgical precision. Jasmine wasn't finished. She had fought too long, too hard to let the moment slip away. "It's time to establish an independent commission," she said, her voice unyielding. "A commission to investigate police misconduct and abuses of power. A commission that will finally hold accountable those who have been allowed to hide behind a badge and the law." The words hung in the air, bold and final, and the room went silent again. Mike Johnson stood frozen, his hand gripping the podium, his knuckles white. His face was a mask of frustration and disbelief. He had always known that Jasmine Crockett was a formidable opponent, but in that moment, she was more than that. She was the voice of those who had been silenced for too long, the force that had torn away the protective layers he had tried so desperately to shield himself with. Jasmine had turned the tide completely. There was no argument left, no justification that could undo the truth she had laid before them. The committee members from both parties exchanged looks. There was no denying the reality anymore. The video, the testimony, Jasmine's unflinching resolve. It had all brought them to this point, and the moment they had tried so hard to avoid had finally arrived. The room was no longer debating a bill. They were debating their integrity, and Jasmine had just given them a choice they couldn't escape: face the truth or continue to protect a system built on injustice. The ball was now in their court. The room was a pressure cooker, the heat building as Jasmine's words sank in. She had made her case. Everything had been laid bare. The video, the testimonies, the truth. There was no place left for hiding. Mike Johnson stood behind his podium, his shoulders rigid, his hands gripping the edges so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His jaw was clenched, his lips pressing together in a tight line, as if he could will the situation into submission. But no amount of posturing, no amount of calculated rhetoric could erase what had just been revealed. Jasmine's gaze was unwavering, her eyes steady, locked onto him. She had already spoken, but the moment wasn't over. There was one final cutting question she had to ask, a question that would pierce through the last of his defenses. The room seemed to exhale as she took a step forward, her voice cutting through the murmur that had begun to rise. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her tone steady but seething with quiet intensity. "You've talked about protecting law enforcement. You've talked about restoring trust. But you've ignored one critical thing." Her eyes never left his, unwavering, like a force of nature, calm but unyielding. The silence in the room thickened as everyone turned toward her, sensing that this was the question that would break everything open. Jasmine's voice dropped, the words measured but carrying the weight of 1,000 lives. "If you were a father," she said, each word drawing the room in closer. "If you were the father of a son who had been beaten to death by police, no weapon, no resistance, would you still be writing this bill? Would you still stand behind it?" The room fell into a profound silence. The question hung there, unanswered, thick with implication. The tension was suffocating. It wasn't just a question about law anymore. It was a question about empathy, about humanity. It was a question that, for the first time in this entire debate, stripped away the political games and placed the truth of human suffering right in front of everyone. The eyes of the committee were fixed on Mike Johnson, their expressions a mix of disbelief and anticipation. Would he answer? Could he answer? How could he? Jasmine stood firm, her posture unshaken, her eyes never leaving his. The question was out there now, and no amount of deflection or political spin could undo the force of it. Mike Johnson's face twitched. For a brief moment, the man who had been so confident, so assured in his defense of the bill, seemed to crack. His mask slipped, just slightly but enough for everyone to see. His mouth opened as if he was about to speak, but no words came. His breath hitched, and his chest rose and fell with a nervousness he hadn't shown before. The silence in the room deepened. The camera zoomed in slowly, almost imperceptibly, focusing on his face. Once a mask of confidence, his expression was now betraying him. His eyes darted around the room, no longer holding the same sense of control. He was searching, almost desperately, for something, anything, that could allow him to answer, to deflect the question, to reassert his position. But there was nothing. The weight of Jasmine's words, the starkness of the reality she had just placed in front of him, was too much. The room was no longer just waiting for his response. It was holding its breath, waiting for the answer that would reveal everything. The camera zoomed in closer, capturing every flicker of uncertainty, every moment of hesitation. For the first time in the entire hearing, Mike Johnson looked vulnerable, his face pale, his eyes wide, his lips trembling as he tried to force a response. But it wouldn't come. The question had shattered the facade. Jasmine didn't need to press him further. The power of the moment lay in the question itself, the simple, brutal honesty of it. A father, a son, a death that could not be explained away. And Mike Johnson, for all his political maneuvering, had no answer to that. Not an answer that would satisfy anyone in that room. Not an answer that could ever justify the law he had been defending. Jasmine took a slow breath, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. It wasn't one of triumph. It was one of quiet understanding. She had done what she came to do. She had exposed the raw truth that no amount of political deflection could hide. She hadn't needed to shout. She hadn't needed to escalate. The truth had spoken for itself, loud and clear, and it had left Mike Johnson speechless. The camera continued to linger on his face, capturing the moment of realization, the loss of confidence, the defeat that couldn't be covered up. Behind him, the other committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The realization was spreading. This wasn't about law anymore. This was about human lives. This was about the people who had been sacrificed on the altar of a system that had failed them. The silence in the room stretched on, and Jasmine stood there, unflinching, waiting. The power of her question had already done its work. It had broken Mike Johnson. It had broken the narrative, and there was no going back now. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.